So good afternoon. Thank you all for joining today and participating in the first of the series for New England Wetland webinars. My name is Audra Martin of NUIPIC, and I will be your moderator today. There we go. Today's webinar will cover some of what Vermont has learned in about 12 years of reviewing solar development projects for wetland impacts. The state has long had renewable energy goals and incentives, which are driving solar energy in the state. And I swear I didn't plan this, but it feels appropriate to be having this presentation on today, which is Super Tuesday, since we've been hearing a lot about clean energy, especially from a certain senator who is from Vermont. But today I am very pleased to welcome a different Vermonter. We have Laura Lapierre joining us as our presenter. She has worked as the Vermont Wetlands Program Manager since 2013. She and her team are responsible for protecting and restoring the over 300,000 acres of wetlands throughout the state through administration of the Vermont Wetland Rules. Laura has been evaluating wetland ecosystems throughout the Northeast for the past 12 years. She holds a Master of Science in Biology from McGill University and a Bachelor of Science from Unity College in Maine. And based off of those locations, I'd say she's probably a true lover of cold climates. All right, so Laura, looks good on my end. Feel free to take it away.
Okay, awesome. Well, let's get rolling. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time today to listen to this webinar. It looks like we have really good attendance, about 35 folks so far. And today I'm here to talk about solar energy and their potential effects on wetlands and really what Vermont's story is. Solar energy in general is really an important piece in the effort to curb climate change. But as with any energy source or development, there are environmental impacts associated with it. Here in Vermont, we've been evaluating and considering the effects of ground-mounted solar arrays in and adjacent to primarily wet meadow wetlands. This development type is very different from traditional development, which we permit. So that's what makes it so interesting. Slide doesn't want to advance. There we go. Here's a more recent picture of our team here in Stowe in this image. I'm the lady in the orange hat and orange rain jacket. And this is our full team. We administer the Vermont Wetland Rules, where we protect significant wetlands, which are classified as Class 1 and Class 2 wetlands. We also protect a buffer zone, which is typically 50 feet from a Class 2 wetland boundary and 100 feet from a Class 1 wetland. We also have a small bioassessment team, so we'll be interested to hear what you have to say next time, Sandy Crystal from New Hampshire. And we also do voluntary restoration work. In particular, we focus on how wetland restoration can improve our water quality. So for my presentation, I'll start with setting the stage of what the climate is for renewable energy in Vermont. Some of our initial experiences and concerns. I'll take you through a photo tour of solar arrays. From there, I'll talk about our recent literature review and study where we actually monitored wetlands that are within solar arrays in Vermont. Some creative plans to ponder here towards the end of ecological restoration and how that might be associated with solar in some instances. And then I'll open it up for comments and questions. And as advertised, this is an overview where we have still many questions about the effects of solar on wetlands. We have some interesting answers, but still lots of questions, so I hope we have a healthy comment session. Just to start off, Vermont has ambitious renewable energy goals. We're hoping that by 2032, 75% of utility sales will be by renewable energy, and solar is a part of that package. In Vermont, we have a Public Utility Commission, which regulates energy, gas, and telecommunication projects. And there are solar projects that are typically called net metering or standard offer projects that are reviewed through that PUC process, as well as through the Vermont wetland rules. And you can see over time, we've steadily gone up and up in the number of projects which we reviewed. This doesn't mean that we permitted over 200 projects here in 2015, just that we really reached a peak in the number of projects that we were reviewing in Vermont. There are smaller projects called net metering, where they're more residential, 50 kilowatt to around 150 kilowatts projects where people develop the solar for their communities, and then they bill back the excess energy to the national grid. And then the standard offer projects are around 2.2 megawatts or less. And to give you a sense, megawatt is 10 to 20 acres of ground-mounted solar, give or take acres too, because there's different technologies. Every spring with the standard offer, the commission submits a request for proposals for projects to fill up the annual grid capacity. In the past year, there was a 10 megawatt amount available, and there'll be 10 megawatts again next year, which means there's a flush of these projects coming in that need to apply within time. So that creates a bit of a frenzy for evaluating field sites. In 2015, Act 56 was put into place. If you're interested in the policy, I'd say look at that document, where we added the ability for municipalities to create site screening requirements because there was a lot of concerns about what ground-mounted solar was doing to the look and feel of the Vermont landscapes. And there was also in that act a way to give preferential treatment to projects built in the built environment. So think parking lots, brownfields, landfills, areas that might be more complicated to develop for solar, but are less impactful to the resources. So we were really happy to see that come around. Over time as well, we've really learned a lot, and I can say one of the questions in the advertisement here was, can solar avoid wetland resources and achieve energy production goals? Well, we've heard through the grapevine that for Vermont solar needs, the ground-mounted sites need to take up around 1% of the state's land mass to meet the energy goals. Now, given that wetlands make up 4% of the state, it seems like there should be the ability to avoid the resources in most cases, with consideration that these sites need to be next to three-phase power lines, and that wetland crossings may be necessary for putting these sites in available upland. We've really permitted less solar arrays in the last 3 years than we did in the 2013-2014 time period. So with this gold rush coming in 2014, there were lots of new developers who didn't necessarily know about permitting, know about wetlands, and were leasing sites before they even evaluated the resource, and were very disappointed when they heard that their site might not be incredibly suitable for their needs. So we worked on brochures such as this one, and did quite a bit of outreach one-on-one with developers to help them understand the need to evaluate the resource. So now's a bit of our picture tour of the presentation. Here is a typical site that we have permitted for a solar array. You can see here's a pink flag here and some down here. This is a hayfield, and this portion of the wetland runs through this low spot and goes into the forested wetland. So the wetland does have significant function and value. And this orange tape is signifying the area where the solar array was being placed. And here's the site plan again. This is the wetland area going off into the forested area. And the array sits right on top of a portion of that wetland and that 50-foot buffer zone. So the impacts were limited to the agricultural hayfield portion. There is no grading or excessive mowing allowed for the development of this project. So there was once annual mowing that was allowed. The forested wetland portion is preserved, and half an acre of the wetland is managed within this solar array's footprint. The function of the wetland as a whole includes flood storage, water protection, and wildlife habitat. The functions within the hayfield piece is primarily surface and groundwater protection. The impacts that were applied for under the wetlands permit was for the individual post for placing these panels on the landscape. We did not consider the mowing as part of the impact area. So the application was actually for 50 square feet of wetland impact, even though it covered over half an acre of hayfield wetland. And this is one of the pieces that we are really researching is it legitimate to have that type of policy? And when we're reviewing these projects, what sorts of considerations do we need to make for the underlying wetlands? So next in our photo tour, this is a big 16 acres of scrub wetland that was cleared for a solar development back in like 2010. This wetland was not protected under the Vermont wetland rules at the time. It was an alder swamp. Once it was cut, there was sparse vegetation. And so when the array was placed up, there was erosional issues, as you can see right here from this, what now looks like a stream that didn't exist before. And here's what it looks like on site. You can see that one of the things that we like to discourage developers from placing things in wetlands is the site's not incredibly stable. And you can see these panels are wobbling, and they had to add extra supports in order for their whole array to not topple over like dominoes after years of freeze and thaw. And then underneath the panels here, interestingly, we have some open area, and we have jewelweed instead of the grasses and rushes in the arrays. So there's something interesting going on here with the vegetation on the site. Also on sites, we see this little crack here has caused rainwater to increase velocities. And over at this site where there are ballast supports, because they didn't want their panels to fall over, here in the wetland, there's a difference in hydrology. These are some interesting sites where they here did not follow their permit conditions, and it made for a pretty big mess that took a lot of time and energy to clean up and button up to prevent additional erosion. And then this site just goes to show sometimes the people who are developing the projects for building aren't thinking about that long-term energy production, or maybe they're just new to it. And we see sites where you end up with some pretty substantial shading issues, which then later the project proponent wants to clear the forested wetland piece because their panels went so close to the resource. So that's just something that we've had to consider and ask about as we go through these projects. So we weren't seeing consistently the same effects as we toured the solar projects that were constructed in wetlands throughout Vermont. It's really different depending on the amount of vegetation present and existing as they're doing their construction. There's differences between tracking panels, like this one here in Rutland moves with the sun, and then these other sites where they're fixed panels that are all in rows. There's also interesting to note, I believe the screw-mounted posts do trigger Army Corps jurisdiction because there's soil being dispersed, but the pile-driven mounts, which I think are those in this image here, are not regulated by the Army Corps. And since it's just the posts, a lot of times these projects are sub-jurisdictional, or not sub-jurisdictional, but are covered under non-reporting general permits. So in some of these cases, the state is the only group that's reviewing the project. Another thing to note, like I said earlier, is that we do a lot of wetland restoration in the state of Vermont. Here's an image of our model of, really good site for restoration here on this agricultural land. And one thing that we wonder is, could these solar projects be competing for the same lands that we're looking to restore for greater wetland function and value? These are typically small arrays, and we would permit small impacts, but it's certainly something to scratch your head over. Another lesson learned here is mowing can be your friend and it can be your enemy with invasive plants. You can see here in this image, when they first constructed, there were just a couple of glossy buckthorns. The very next year, the seed bank, I don't know, it just exploded, and there have been lots of glossy buckthorn on this site still last summer. And the honeysuckle, there is just one tartan honeysuckle, and that's also very prevalent on this site, although most of the site is outside of the wetland, which is the teal area in the 2015 image. And they've changed their mowing. What they originally had to do was mow after September 15th because of concerns for a rare blue-eyed grass in the upland area where they didn't want to harm their reproduction. But that also meant that mowing occurred when most of the invasives were reproductive, and it caused seed dispersal. So now there's a scheme of mowing early to prevent reproduction, but not in the blue-eyed grass area, and then a late mowing to prevent late season reproduction, and some targeted herbicide use. And this plan goes off into 2023. So with all of that consideration, we received an EPA grant to study this a bit more. We had a lot of anecdotal information, and we wanted to get more quantitative information to inform our permit decisions. And to start with, we did a literature review, or I should say our consultants, Arrowwood Environmental and Fitzgerald Environmental Associates, two local groups here in Vermont. And they found a number of things. Generally, there are very few studies on environmental impacts from the construction and operation of solar. Most of that was for the southwestern United States and had to do with water scarcity. There weren't any published works that addressed impacts on wetland function and value. There were lots of theories of what solar panels might be doing, but no quantitative evidence, such as changes in land surface and soil temperatures, hydrology, precipitation regime, wind speed, potential water and soil pollution, erosion issues, and soil compaction. There were a couple of studies that did have some quantitative information, but there wasn't much consistency. They had found that there was an average soil temperature up to 5 degrees Celsius cooler underneath the panels in one study, and then the opposite effect in the wintertime. And also that there was concentrated flow under the drip line, and that could cause a tenfold increase in the kinetic energy. So from that study informed our ideas for how to monitor within and around solar arrays to assess the impacts. So the point of this study was to develop the methodologies as well as do the monitoring. So there have been some changes to the methodologies in the 2 years of sampling in 2018 and 2019. We didn't expect massive results in 2 years of study. We're mostly concerned about long-term effects. So we thankfully received another EPA grant to continue monitoring these sites in the field seasons of 2020 and 2021. So there's still a lot more to this story. The objective, or what we were looking at, was 5 commercial ground-mounted solar arrays on land converted from agricultural management within a Class 2 wetland. There was sampling of vegetation, soils, and hydrology to assess the effects back to wetland functions, and specifically water quality protection and water storage. So there were samples taken within the shade of the arrays, within the rows in the sunny areas, and within reference points outside of the arrays, which were still being used for agriculture, so mowed as well, because we were looking at the effects of the difference from the agriculture to the solar array effects. We had 1 by 1 meter vegetation plots. We looked at species composition, total percent cover, height. We looked at density in the first year, but found that the stem counts were really difficult and weren't found to be very useful, so we removed that. We measured the size and magnitude of erosion, whether sheet flow, rilling, gully, length of panel drip lines. We looked at soil compaction and the nutrients of the soil, and the metals were analyzed. So here's a sneak preview of our results, or I'm going to call them observations for now, because the analysis is being done as I speak. We will have a final report of the 2-year study in April, which we will put up on our website, and I can certainly make it available for NUI-PIC to post as well. So some of the observations was that the shade plots exhibited slightly lower percent cover and species diversity compared to the rows and the reference sites. All of the soil profiles still exhibited the hydric soil indicators, so the wetlands aren't drying up. There was elevated zinc levels in the soils, in the sun and shade areas compared to the reference sites. And there is also more iron, magnesium, and sulfur in the sun areas of the array compared to the reference and shade sites. Some other findings. We did not find any significant erosion. There were some mowing ruts forming. As you can imagine, when you're haying a field, you can mow in any direction you want, but with the arrays, you have to mow with your tires in the same spot. So that could be an interesting finding in the future. The compaction at 2 of the 5 sites showed consistently lower compaction underneath the panels. The slowest infiltration rates were in disturbed areas under tracker panels instead of the fixed arrays. The impacted sun sites had the lowest infiltration rates for the fixed arrays. Also, the available phosphorus was slightly elevated for shade and sun sites at 3 of these arrays. So there's still a lot for us to explore and compare the 2 years and see if there's any statistical significance here. Beyond this, we have 2 more years of a study on these same sites, so we'll be able to see more of the long-term effects. So besides exploring the impacts of solar arrays within wetlands, I also want to talk about some of the creativeness that we have here for wetland enhancement. Here's a small site of a solar array here within the orange. The lighter color is the regular mow zone. The light green is where they planted shrubs within the arrays. They selected plants that were low in stature, tolerated wet soils, and tolerated periodic flooding. The species included chokeberry, buttonbush, willow, meadowsweet, and such. And over the past couple of years, they reviewed the effects of that. And here we have some pretty lush shrubby vegetation growing. There's very high survival rate. They get in and they hand clip so that way the woody vegetation doesn't shade the panels. But it's really interesting. It's choking out the invasive reed canary grass and becoming shrub wetland. So the question to ask or think about is the solar and shrubs better ecologically than the pastured field that was there before? Another thought here is a site that had some cattle exclusion. So there's wetland area here in this swale going down to this pond that cattle had been drinking at, walking through. The wetland area extends up into this forested area. And as part of this project, they planted shrubs in here and they put in fencing to keep the cattle out of this water. And it's growing up, and there's a lot less erosion and animal droppings in that area. Other things that folks are looking at is how could solar and pollinators coexist, and how can birds and solar coexist? These are just some interesting things for us to be thinking about with our. So in conclusion, the situation really isn't black and white, totally good, totally bad. There's a lot of gray area that needs to be explored. I left the list of the questions that I had asked in the advertisement for this. I hope I was able to answer some things, gave you some good food for thought. And right now, I'd like to just open this up for audience comments and questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. As promised, you did leave us with a few questions to consider, but hopefully the audience came up with some questions of their own as well. So you can go ahead and anyone can type in a question in the question box, or if you want to vocalize your own question, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you so that you can ask your question. Okay, and I do have one question now, asking about the conversion of forested wetland to emergent or shrub, and have you studied that?
We have not. We permit solar impacts based off of the effects on functions and values, and the conversion from one wetland type, cover type to another is one that we're, clearly saying there's an impact, and we push really hard for avoidance and minimization of those areas. There has been some selective cutting that we've allowed in cases where there are trees that are so tall that they're shading, but that hasn't been anything specific in our study with Arrowwood and Fitzgerald Environmental. Maybe we should add it.
The same person has a follow-up question. If there's been any published papers on your work, or maybe that's just the report that you're working on now for April.
There is no published work. I think that it's premature for the 2-year study for us to publish anything. And I'd be very interested in doing that, though, after our additional 2 years of study, so that there is actually something in the literature on what's happening in these situations. I'd also like to put in a plug that if any other state has similar circumstances and would like to use our methodology that's been developed, we'd be really happy to give you that information and continue the study with you.
Okay, great. Yeah, Alicia Rodrian is saying she would like that information, so I'll try to connect you guys or get her your contact information, Laura.
Awesome.
And I'm sure other listeners would be interested if you do happen to know of any published work on solar panels and wetlands to share that with any resources that you have with the group, and I could send that out to participants if you know of anything.
Yep,
so I'm going to move on to
provide the literature review that I had talked about.
Sure, yeah, that would be great, and I think people would find that useful. Another question, I'll move on. Do you require compensation for conversion impacts?
For solar projects, we've typically gotten the impacts down to a small amount so that we're not looking at traditional compensation. We do ask for minimization of the effects that occur on the site. Like in this image, you see a little cedar planting. At that site too, there was a significant natural community in the forest where they were conducting invasive control of existing invasives to enhance that natural community type. And the shrub plantings within the arrays is another instance where we asked for a level of minimization by enhancing the wetland. One thing that is kind of interesting to note is a lot of these sites are they're leasing the land from the farmers for like a 20 or 30-year period, and then they're supposedly decommissioning or reinstating them for another 20 years. And a lot of times the farmer looks to their less productive land, which is often technically wetland area. So that's where we were bumping into a lot of sites being proposed in wet meadow situations. And a lot of these arrays ended up being built outside of the wetland and buffer zone. And because the arrays are adjacent to the wetlands, the farmers may have ceased producing in the wetland areas that are adjacent. So there might be some passive restoration taking place as well.
Thanks, Laura. And we got a question that is really similar to what you were just speaking to about the decommissioning, and if the wetland areas are allowed to go back to, or if they go back to agricultural use, or if they're allowed to naturally revegetate. So it sounds like maybe there's some options there.
Yeah, the Public Utility Commission's certificates has a standard requirement that when they're decommissioning these sites in and adjacent to wetlands, they contact the Wetlands program to ensure that their decommissioning doesn't harm the wetland and that they get any necessary permits.
Okay, thank you. And then another question on the example that you shared where the shrubs were planted between the arrays and they were doing a hand clipping. Who was responsible for that maintenance, and were the developers resistant to including additional interventions like that in the design?
The developers are responsible for it, as well as giving us annual reports. That was actually a site where it was constructed without the proper permits. So that was part of the our way of minimizing the effects of the array so we could permit it after the fact. And that one did actually have a bit of compensation associated with it. But they've been really interested in doing that. And there are a lot of solar developers who have been asking us, well, couldn't we develop in the wetlands in a way that we are restoring the wetland areas at the same time? And one of the issues with that is just the long-term restoration piece to it, where they're unable to find conservation groups, or the landowner doesn't want to put their area in conservation in perpetuity. But there is a lot of interest in potentially doing that, and we always go back to, well, there are rules are for avoiding and minimizing impacts to the greatest extent practicable first, and then from there we look at other options.
All right, Alicia, hi. I think I unmuted you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, how have the conservation groups and other NGOs, like the Sierra Club and other wetland protection nonprofits, reacted to this kind of work?
Yeah, there's definitely concerns, there's one entity that years ago contacted me about the concern of there being sort of competition for these marginal lands to for that might be really good restoration sites, but solar is being proposed in those areas. And I guess because there is a lot of available upland, we've been really successful in having a lot of arrays shrink down to a size or move over so that they're not within the resource area. And that's been a lot of work for our group, and I'm really proud of what we've been able to do with that avoidance and minimization. So there isn't a lot of conservation groups that are voicing a lot of concern nowadays. And I honestly haven't had the conversation with the conservation groups on the solar developers' ideas of placing the arrays in farmed wetlands and restoring in some way within the rows. This is just based off of my conversations with the solar developers who are trying to get conservation group interest.
Okay, Laura, hopefully you're good with a few more questions. Going back to the sites that have the shrubs between the rows, do you know if the site owner saw any premature failure of the PV modules because of the irregular shading, like bypass diode failures or cell failure or something like that? And you may not know that.
Because
she said, yeah, from the irregular shading.
I think that the
concept, where there was
the shrub. Okay, so I think that the concept was that they're trimming so that there isn't shading. So I haven't heard any issues about reduced solar production on that site, but that would be interesting to follow up with them.
And do you think that that your results will be put into regulatory guidance? I'm guessing that's probably from your mind.
Yeah, that's our hope, is if we're able to find that there are certain types of certain ways to do these developments that we could put into BMPs and such, I'd really like the science to inform our policy.
Yeah, does Vermont, and maybe you mentioned this, do you have any non-regulatory guidance or BMPs issued around solar for wetlands right now?
We have that brochure that I showed earlier, but that's all that we have.
Oh, yeah, okay. But it sounds like that's something that you're working towards.
Yes.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and just move on to end the webinar today. I'm sure Laura would be happy to take any other questions offline if you have those, and to connect with some of the resources that she mentioned today.
Certainly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura, for your great presentation today, as well as thank you to everybody who took the time to tune in. I think we had about 35 or 36 people today, so that's great. I will mention that as you leave the webinar, there's an opportunity to provide feedback to me on how we can improve these webinars, or if you have any suggestions for future topics that you'd like to see. So please take a second to answer that, and I really do look at all of that, and will address anything that you bring up. So thank you one last time to Laura for presenting, and that is all for today. Thank you so much for joining.